I'm Anne Marie Slaughter, Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University.
And I'm Stephen Walt, Professor of International Affairs at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard.
So, Steve, what do you think the President should do first in the sense of his foreign policy priorities?
The most important thing he's going to have to do with respect to foreign policy is downplay a lot of expectations. I think, as most people realize, most of President Obama's attention is going to have to focus on the economy. That has a foreign policy dimension to it in that he's going to want to get collaboration from a number of other economically important countries to try and coordinate a response to this. But much of his attention is going to be focused on the American domestic economy. And that means he's got to try and get some breathing room on foreign policy and not try to do too much too soon.
But I agree with that he's going to have to focus on the economy. And from my point of view, there are enormous foreign policy implications because to the extent growth drops in countries like China or the Russian economy gets weaker, you risk real insecurity in those countries and then the danger of creating a nationalist scapegoat. So keeping the global economy afloat and our national economy afloat is in our foreign policy interests as well. But he's also going to have to immediately go and meet with General Petraeus and find out for himself, or have General Petraeus come to Washington, find out for himself what the conditions are on the ground in Iraq, what a responsible plan looks like. And in Afghanistan, we need a strategy. We don't have a strategy that works. So from my point of view, he's fighting two wars and he can't put them on hold.
Yeah, no, I think there's no question. And if you asked me then to follow up my first comment with sort of, so what does he do on foreign policy? I think that you've just put your finger on the first two sort of most immediate things. He's going to have to decide whether or not he's going to follow up on his campaign pledge, basically to get us out of Iraq as quickly as possible and stick to the timetable that he identified in the campaign. And then the second commitment he made was to actually do more in Afghanistan. My own view is I hope he rethinks that one, at least subjects it to a bit more scrutiny, talks to people who have been directly engaged there, talks more widely to people in the United States, because pulling troops out of Iraq just to deploy them in Afghanistan may simply substitute one unwinnable war for another one.
But he doesn't have much choice in Afghanistan. From my point of view, he can't pull out of Afghanistan. We may not be able to win in a traditional sense, but we certainly at least have to get Afghanistan back to the point where there's a fairly strong central government that is capable of protecting the majority of the Afghan people, so that the Afghan people are not once again in a position where they support the government and the Americans by day and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban by night.
Right. But I think Afghanistan actually illustrates one of the major conceptual errors of the last decade or so of American foreign policy. And that was the failure to fully appreciate the power of, local loyalties, local identities, things based on ethnicity, religion, and nationalism. The question is, can you solve the problems in Afghanistan by deploying more and more American power, which is perceived, rightly or wrongly, as hostile? It's perceived as a foreign occupying force, and plays into much of the sort of Taliban and jihadi narrative about evil Westerners coming here to interfere with the traditional way of life. I think a precipitous Western withdrawal from Afghanistan is not a good idea, but the more rapidly we can turn this into an Afghan problem rather than an American problem, the better. So I'd actually be looking for ways to start reducing the Western presence in Afghanistan, and to the extent that there is a presence, it ought to be focused on building up the Afghan army, which has actually done reasonably well in the last year or so, and trying to encourage the formation of a more stable Afghan government, even if that involves trying to structure some participation with remnants of the Taliban or elements of the Taliban that might be willing to participate more constructively in rebuilding Afghanistan. But I think more American troops there is simply going to exacerbate the problem.
Well, I'd be very worried that pulling out of Afghanistan, even if it's slower, is in fact, handing another major victory to al-Qaeda and the Taliban. They kicked the Soviets out of Afghanistan. That fact gave them enormous credibility around the Islamic world in terms of recruiting and also then fighting as the Taliban took over. If they can then kick the United States and NATO out of Afghanistan, I think we are going to be reaping that harvest for years to come. But I also worry that what has to happen in Afghanistan is enough troops and the placement of those troops to provide security for the people. So we can't sit in bases and periodically make forays out to attack whoever's attacking us or to attack al-Qaeda. But we actually have to be in with the people, which is very complicated given the geography of Afghanistan, so that we are providing enough security to actually get local loyalties back toward the central government, back toward us. And I just have to say, I don't think any American administration, but certainly not an Obama administration, is going to be able to broker a deal with the Taliban, given the Taliban's treatment of women.
That's probably true, but I worry that that's essentially a recipe for endless war. That even if Obama does manage to get us out of Iraq, then his administration will be characterized by 4 years or possibly 8 years of a long, difficult counterinsurgency, which, in addition to involving Afghanistan, of course, may end up involving Pakistan. And if you sort of step back for a second and say, how did the United States come to be engaged in a counterinsurgency war in Central Asia, tens of thousands, or 10,000 or more miles from the United States, in a country whose combined gross domestic product is about $7 billion? So far we've spent about $170 billion in Afghanistan since 2001. And this is on a country that really isn't worth much more than that.
Wait a minute.
I'm just not sure that sort of playing hide and go seek with Taliban elements around Afghanistan is a smart strategy overall for the United States.
But as I recall, you were very prescient about the Iraq War. You led a movement against going into the Iraq War. But I recall part of your argument at the time was it was the wrong war. That we should be focusing in Afghanistan. I mean, the difference between the Iraqi counterinsurgency and the Afghan counterinsurgency is that the Afghan counterinsurgency is in part the guys who actually did attack us on 9/11 and who would like to attack us in every way they can. So this is a counterinsurgency, it seems to me, we can't afford not to fight. Yes, it may take 10 years. Most successful counterinsurgency campaigns do take that long, but the stakes here are vital for our national security in ways that I don't think we could say that the Iraqi regime was.
Yeah. Certainly, if you'd asked me a few years ago, should we be focusing our attention on Afghanistan and pursuing al-Qaeda there, I would have said fine. And I think I'm not suggesting the United States should immediately announce that we're leaving in toto. As I said, we ought to be focusing primarily our effort on building up the Afghan National Army and trying to strengthen the central government. We should not see it primarily as a task where the United States and NATO increases its presence, gets more and more involved in trying to manage the internal politics there. I mean, the history of Afghanistan is that it has been a relatively loose central authority for a long time based on a variety of shifting ethnic coalitions, and that's a game we don't know how to play. It's a game the Afghans have been doing for decades, if not longer. And as in Iraq, the sooner we can turn the governance of Afghanistan back to Afghanis and taking it out of our hands, the better. And so I worry that sending another 20,000 troops to Afghanistan will not solve the problem. The temptation will then be to send a few more, and we can look back on this as a little bit like Johnson's decision to escalate in Vietnam in 1965. So I'm not prepared to have the United States completely leave, and certainly having special forces go after al-Qaeda when we know where they are, that's fine. But the idea that we should be engaged in a large, ambitious nation-building project in Afghanistan for the next 5, 10, 15 years strikes me as a bad investment of American resources, particularly at a time when our resources are much more constrained than they looked like they were a few years ago.
Well, we may be able to agree in part. I actually think we probably are going to need more troops in the shorter run. I recognize the danger always of escalation, but above all, we do need a strategy. We don't actually have a strategy for what we're doing in Afghanistan right now. Is it focused on al-Qaeda? Is it focused on shoring up the Karzai government? Is it helping a new government at least establish enough power to be the central node in what, you're right, has been a loosely governed country with very strong provinces? But let's agree to disagree on how long we're going to have troops there, and whether or not it's worth it when you have al-Qaeda on the border. Let's assume we've got Barack Obama has the troops home from Iraq, and he's either in Afghanistan or he's pulled them out responsibly, in your view. Where does he go next?
Well, as won't surprise you, I mean, he has promised that, unlike previous presidents, he is going to focus very heavily on the Israel-Palestine conflict sooner rather than later. You know, he will not wait till the last years of his presidency. I certainly hope he does, not because that solves every problem that the United States has in the Middle East or in the rest of the world, but because it is a significant problem. Moreover, it's one where you can see the sort of window of opportunity beginning to close. And I think most people who've looked carefully at this see a two-state solution as the only viable one. And there's, I think, growing concern on all sides, in Israel, in the Palestinian community, and in the United States, that the opportunity for a two-state solution may, in fact, be evaporating. I think what really needs to happen here is for people to understand that being pro-Israel now does not mean providing unconditional support. It actually, being pro-Israel requires the United States to be more even-handed and to use the leverage at its disposal to try and bring about a settlement as soon as possible. So I'm hoping that Obama and his team will focus on that one, and will focus on it early, and will do so not sort of business as usual, where we try to broker a solution without putting any pressure on anybody, but actually get very serious about announcing what we think an acceptable solution is and trying to bring both sides to it using all the influence at our disposal. I just sort of remind people who watch this that it was former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert who said that if the two-state solution collapses, Israel will face a South Africa-style struggle, and if that happens, he said, the state of Israel is finished. So this is a point where, you know, again, being pro-Israel is to actually push very hard for a solution, and that'd be good for the United States. That would certainly improve our standing throughout the rest of the region, and indeed elsewhere in the world. It would also be good for Israel, and it would be good for the Palestinians. So it's a win-win-win if he can summon the political will and skill to do that.
So I agree that getting there, a two-state solution, is a win-win-win all round, and a win in the larger region, because then it changes the political geography of the region as a whole. But it seems to me that is very high-stakes poker, because it's worth risking his political capital if there is a realistic chance of actually getting a settlement. If there's not, he will have spent his political capital. He probably will have made a number of enemies domestically along the way, and then he's no better off anywhere else. So if you're advising him where to put his energies after you focused on the economy and two wars, that seems to me to be a very high-stakes game, because George W. Bush did outline a two-state solution, did make clear that that was what he wanted. That has come to naught. And at this point, with the current Israeli government and with Netanyahu there in the wings, it's hard for me to see how the politics of it are going to get us to any kind of solution.
Well, I think, Bush did outline that was his goal, but he basically never did anything to actually bring it about. So if you were looking for a blueprint of how to run Middle East policy, and particularly with respect to this issue, take whatever George Bush did and do the opposite. And of course, one of the things that he did, and to some degree Clinton did as well, was to wait till late in the game. There will undoubtedly be people who will give Obama exactly the advice you spelled out, that this is not something to handle in the first year. And then in the second year, someone will say, well, yes, it'd be time to tackle this one now, but, we have midterm elections coming up, so that's not a particularly auspicious time. And then in year 3, you'll be told, it's time to start gearing up for your re-election campaign, and this doesn't look like a good issue to handle. So maybe we should do this first thing in the second term. Of course,
Right.
by then, the window of opportunity may be gone. It may simply be impossible to actually effect a two-state solution at that point. So I think, the Obama presidency is going to have to make a very hard decision early on of whether or not they're serious about this and whether or not they really believe in trying to do something on behalf of our friends in the region, on behalf of the Palestinians, and something that will improve our relations with other countries there. If not, I fear that, there's sort of a tragic outcome here with the best of intentions.
Well, we're going to find out quite a bit then about Obama's temperament, because this is really an all or nothing roll of the dice. It could be transformative if you put your energy into it right up front, contrary to what other presidents have done, and you win very big indeed. If you lose, as I said, you've spent a lot of valuable political capital, but it will be interesting to see whether he's that kind of a risk taker.
Right.
And again, part of that's going to depend on the analysis of the likelihood of getting there of the people around him. And I'm sure he's going to get conflicting opinions.
Yeah, that is a certainty.
So the thing I would tell him to do, which is sort of sneaking in foreign policy by the back door, but if his first priority is the domestic economy, there's some very interesting literature and policy proposals that effectively argue that he should have a green initiative, a green technology initiative, but not just subsidies for new technology, but actually imposing standards in cities, building codes, infrastructure, that this would in fact move us toward the kind of low-carbon economy we need to move to, but it would also create millions of jobs because of the need then to retrofit lots of old buildings and lots of infrastructure. My point is that taking that kind of a step would be a very effective way of announcing to the world that we now take climate change seriously and that we're doing things that will make it easier for us to accept emissions cuts, thereby putting us in better position to negotiate, if not a global deal, at least a deal among the major emitters.
I think that's nice, and here's what worries me about it is that the United States is now in a position very different than we found ourselves in, say, 8 years ago, where we had a budget surplus, where the economy had been roaring along for quite some time. And the question that people are going to ask is, well, what's that actually going to cost to move in that direction? I mean, I think some kind of infrastructure stimulus is probably in the cards, and focusing it on climate change would make a lot of sense and would certainly give us a certain amount of high ground. But we face this interesting paradox that at a moment where the world economy is hurting, it's going to be more difficult to craft a climate change deal than in a moment when everyone's feeling relatively flush and feeling like they can afford to take some steps that are bound to be costly. I guess I don't object to that basic idea, but I think it's going to be trickier than you suggest. I might add that there's sort of a good news, bad news in the global recession. The good news being that we actually pump out fewer greenhouse gases when the economy isn't humming along. The bad news is it's harder to craft a deal because no one's willing to take hits to their own domestic economy in order to pull this off.
But I think he has to demonstrate his bona fides on climate change. This is, again, both a matter of what he promised during the campaign, but it's also about change. It's about new politics. It's about an inconvenient truth and facing up to that inconvenient truth. So I don't think he can let that one go until his second year. On the other hand, as we've discussed, he doesn't have the bandwidth to undertake any kind of major negotiations. I mean, Copenhagen is coming up in 2011. He can prepare, the State Department can prepare, but I would advise him to do something that is bold, but that is national in scope, that would challenge other nations effectively to follow suit, to effectively address that issue while he's working on the economy, and then turn to some kind of international negotiations. The other proposal is that you get the E8, the major emitters, together and hammer out a deal. And there I agree with you that I right now I would not be wanting to persuade the Chinese government that it's time to cut coal emissions.
Right. Right, exactly. I mean, I haven't looked at the details of the stimulus package that China recently announced, but my guess is it doesn't have a big green component in it.
No, I don't think so. So what about institutional reform? I mean, this one is everybody's favorite whipping boy. Oh boy, now we get to talk about UN reform and talk about something that people want to put off. On the other hand, this weekend we are seeing in Washington a meeting of the G20 to talk explicitly about a global financial architecture. I should say the G20 at leaders level. In other words, the leaders of the roughly 20 nations that came together after the East Asian financial crisis, which are effectively all the major economies of the world.
Right. I think that if that UN reform is going to get kicked to the back of the line yet again, and partly because it's too hard. That is to say, nobody can quite come up with a package and decide who gets. If you're going to enlarge the Security Council, who gets in, who doesn't. You end up goring too many oxes when you try to handle that particular negotiation. And I also don't think people would regard it as a sufficiently important step. It would be a nice thing to do. It might make the United Nations a bit more relevant, certainly give it a little bit more legitimacy in the eyes of some countries. But it's not going to be seen as having sort of an immediate, tangible effect on the way the world works. I think actually operating within the G20 is a much more likely road if you're thinking about sort of the institutions of global governance. Giving the G20 more prominence, possibly adjusting some of the ways in which the World Bank and IMF do business, altering voting shares there because of different levels of contribution. That's the kind of rearrangement of global architecture I can see as more feasible. And, UN reform, I'm afraid, will probably get kicked down the road.
Well, I do think there's an opportunity with the G20. It exists. Its membership obviously includes the G7 plus Russia, but then plus India and China and Brazil and Mexico and Argentina and South Africa, but also Turkey, Indonesia, Australia, and South Korea. Those are all countries that are important. Most of them are U.S. allies. Most of them are democracies. It's a good group, and it exists. So I agree that we should start there. It also gets past this vexed question of whether you expand the G8 to G12, G13, G16, and depending what part of the world you're from and what country you're from, you have a different answer to those questions. So from my point of view, start with what's there. Formalize it. It would be possible, actually, to make the G20 of finance ministers the executive committee or the steering committee of a broader global network of finance ministers. So you're not cutting everybody out, but you've got the people who are actually making the decisions already in the G20, and then connecting that up to a reformed World Bank and IMF. I do have a proposal, though, on the UN. I don't think it's vital, although in terms of public diplomacy and managing expectations but also meeting some, I think the administration could get a lot of mileage out of announcing that the high-level panel for threats, challenges, and change, basically Kofi Annan's panel to look at UN reform, had two plans for Security Council reform. There was either Germany, Japan, Brazil, and India being added as permanent members but with no veto, which is something those four countries very much want, or there was something called Plan B that had a rotating system that effectively guaranteed the same result, but no country got to call itself a permanent member. I think the United States could simply announce, we think there's been plenty of planning and consulting and negotiating. There are two plans on the table. Whichever plan can go through the General Assembly, we will support, and we will put our capital behind. And that leaves the Gang of Four, Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil, hustling like crazy for votes. If they can get enough votes in the General Assembly, we support that. If they can't, we go to Plan B. I actually think it would get us some mileage to say, we, for a change, recognize that we have to widen the councils of decision, even though we benefit from the current structure.
I think at the level of sort of global PR, yes, that might work. I mean, you and I disagree on how important that ultimately would be to sort of the state of world politics. I think ultimately it wouldn't actually, change a lot of outcomes around the world. very much. But if we can, start the Obama presidency with a number of gestures that mark a clear departure from the way we were doing business for the last 8 years, that's terrific. I said earlier today on another blog that Obama should put in his inaugural address that we are closing Guantanamo, and we're going to prosecute those people that we feel like we have evidence to convict in federal courts, and go back to the rule of law as we used to know it in the United States. I think that would be the same sort of tangible public relations gesture that would suggest there's a new sheriff in town and he's going to do business a little bit differently.
Well, we're completely agreed on that he should announce that he's
Let's find something we can disagree on.
No, we're going to disagree in just a minute, but we would... I don't think there's no disagreement in terms of announcing that he's closing Guantanamo. I would add signing up to the Geneva Conventions again, in the sense of making it clear that the Geneva Conventions cover all interrogations by all United States officials rather than exempting the CIA, which is what we're doing right now. I think that's going to be complicated because there's some people we probably can't try, and what you do with them is going to have to be worked out probably by a commission. But we agree there. But I think there's a deeper disagreement. One of the reasons I think the United Nations is more important is that I see us still being engaged in many parts of the world, and the blessing of the United Nations is very important for that kind of engagement. So it's particularly important to have the United Nations be respected by many countries, by the vast majority of countries around the world, as being more representative. But I do see multilateral engagement, but with the United Nations, with the United States very much a part of those coalitions, as critical to addressing the challenges we face. And I think you have a much narrower view of what we ought to be doing.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with the United States thinking in terms of multilateral engagement. But given how powerful the United States still is, it is always going to reserve the right to act independently when it thinks it really has to. And in that sense, it's no different than any other country, which would also act independently if its vital interests were at stake. And, nobody really disagrees with that. I think where we disagree is what the scope of American ambition ought to be. I think we've witnessed now a sort of 18-year period where the United States has had a very expansive definition of its interests and had a very ambitious sense of what it was trying to accomplish in the world. It was George Bush Sr. who said back in, I think, 1991 or 92 that the United States found itself, standing at the pinnacle of power with the rarest opportunity to reshape the world. And we've gone to considerable lengths to try and do that, with sort of Iraq being then the apotheosis of it. I think going forward, not just because of the problems of our economy in the last few months, but also all of the problems we've caused for ourselves, the United States has to adopt a more restrained view of its international commitments. It has to start putting burdens back on other people instead of letting them free ride on us. And I don't think that means returning to isolationism, but if we don't do less, we're not going to be able to get others to do more. So, I guess I worry that the Obama administration is going to look an awful lot like the Clinton administration and engage in some of the what I would regard as the excesses it engaged in, and then that were taken to an even worse extreme by the Bush administration.
So what about Darfur? I mean, we know that Obama has spoken out on Darfur. Susan Rice, who's likely to have a very high position in the administration, has written that NATO troops should actually go into Darfur, or certainly in strong supporting roles, and even beyond that. There's a lot of public opinion pressure on Darfur, and I think real expectations that as an African-American president who has spoken out on these issues, he's going to be expected to do something. Are you suggesting that we should effectively not do anything, or simply let the status quo continue?
I think the United States should be behind diplomatic efforts conducted by the United Nations and others to try and resolve that. But if the question is, should the United States deploy its own military forces to try and deal with the problem in Darfur, I don't think we should, and I don't think we will. I think that if there is a silver lining to the problems we're currently facing is that it is, in fact, going to force Obama to think very hard about priorities, think very hard about what vital interests are, and humanitarian intervention, as it always has, is going to rank relatively far down the list. It's simply not a vital interest to the United States. It's one that we care about for humanitarian reasons. But it's going to be pretty hard to get Americans at this point in time to invest a lot of blood and treasure there. My guess is he will not go that direction.
I don't think I disagree. I certainly, it's not on your or my list of priorities. But I think here actually is an opportunity to work more to get other partners to shoulder more of the burden. This is more in the EU's backyard than ours. It's not a vital interest for European countries, but they have a lot to worry about in terms of what happens in North Africa and then moving towards Central Africa. And they also have been talking about developing rapid reaction forces, using NATO assets with their national armies. This is an area in which I can see working very hard at the UN, as the Bush administration has done, but at some point, if there is simply no movement at the UN, then supporting some kind of NATO coordinated support for African troops. I don't think we're going to send our own troops in. I don't think no European country is going to go in for any length of time. But on the other hand, it is an area in which I think we could convince Europeans that they have to take a more active role if anything is going to get done.
Well, again, the problem is it's not a vital interest for the Europeans as well. And we're having enough trouble getting them to step up in Afghanistan. It seems to me that if we're trying to continue to work on the Afghan problem, we're not going to have a whole lot of leverage with the Europeans to do Darfur, and that may be tragic. This is one of these things that then many people will write books complaining about how we allowed a disaster to happen again. But I think that's unfortunately the way the world often works. So again, I think it's going to be a hard sell overseas. We may be able to get some African countries to take the lead there. You may be able to work within the United Nations, as we have to some degree. But I think it's not going to be something that bubbles up to the top of the Obama to-do list.
Well, I think it may well form one of the early test cases of his administration, in that, as I said, there are a number of former Clinton officials who feel very strongly about Darfur, in part because of their experience with not doing anything in Rwanda, and it will be much higher on their priority list than it may be on the national priority list, which really will probably give President Obama one of his early decisions in terms of where his priorities are, because he, of course, was not engaged in foreign policy in the Clinton administration.
Right. But, I think there's an important lesson here, right? And that is that, even for the United States, the number of things you can do is not infinite. If you just sort of make a list of what is conceivably on an American president's plate, or what's on his administration's plate, right? We have Iraq, we have Afghanistan, we have the Middle East peace process, we have Iran, which we haven't even talked about yet. There's relations with China, relations with Pakistan, Colombia, Venezuela, Darfur, the Doha round and the fact that it failed, and what you might want to try to do to restart the world economy. That's an incredibly full agenda, and you've only got 24 hours in a day.
And you've omitted nuclear counterproliferation.
I've left out counterterrorism. I've left out non-proliferation. Right? There's all sorts of other stuff there.
Right.
And the biggest concern I have, of course, is that we are in a sufficiently deep hole right now that the administration is going to come in and try and fix everything all at once. I think that's a mistake, and I'm hoping that they will be able to come in and say, look, here are the 3-4 things that we're going to try to accomplish right off the bat, and we're going to work very hard on. We're going to invest the president's own political capital and personal time and attention on them. The other things, we're going to play a holding game. We're going to try to make sure they don't get worse. We'll obviously have to delegate those to the relevant departments and relevant assistant secretaries, etc., but we're not going to make them a big top priority event. I think if they don't manage to set some pretty clear priorities right off the bat, they're going to find themselves sort of nibbled to death And again, this means Americans have to start getting out of the habit of thinking that they are the indispensable nation that has to be directly involved in solving every global problem, and starting to ask, what are the things that we care most about that we're willing to deploy American power to try and deal with? And I mean all forms of American power, not just its military power. And what are the things that we're going to let others take care of?
So one way to look at your prescriptions and my prescriptions is we both agree on the things that the president absolutely has to do, although we have just different views of what he should do. But he's got to focus on the global economy, then Iraq and Afghanistan, can't avoid those. After that, you can imagine a scenario that says, all right, you need to focus on one thing that you can really get done, and then move from there to another strength. And you've argued he should focus on the Middle East. If he could finally bring off an Israeli-Palestinian settlement, it would be an extraordinary achievement, but also would aid our security in countless ways. I can well imagine other members of his administration saying, no, that one's a quagmire. Start with non-proliferation. Start with the announcement that you want a world without nuclear weapons, and start with fairly dramatic unilateral cuts, following the playbook of George Shultz and Henry Kissinger. This is not a Democratic idea. Bill Perry and Sam Nunn signing on also, but to announce that this is something that truly is going to change the nature of global politics, and the United States could do it. So there could be other dramatic initiatives, but I think you're right that after the issues he has to focus on, choosing one area where he can really score a win makes a lot of sense.
Well, I've argued for unilateral cuts for a long time because I think there's no need for the United States to have as large an arsenal as it currently does. I think the main thing there is you want to get a quid pro quo for it. There will be people, nothing will reinvigorate the American right than an Obama announcement that he is unilaterally disarming, even if he plans on keeping 1,000 weapons, and even if the Russians decide to go along. I think this has to be linked to a some kind of global arrangement to reinvigorate the Non-Proliferation Treaty, whether it's linked to a global agreement on more vigilance on nuclear custody, greater security for nuclear materials, possibly a fissile materials cutoff, something like that. Then I think it's going to be easier to sell it as something that's an overall increase in American security. We're not just giving up something, we're actually getting something for it. I might add that's going to be linked, I think, to what happens in the evolving relationship with Iran. So maybe we ought to turn to that now. What would you tell him to do about Iran?
Well, you read my mind. I was thinking that one of the major advantages to having a big initiative with respect to cuts is that it puts us in a much stronger global bargaining position vis-a-vis Iran. It puts pressure on Iran from the point of view of the nuclear haves, once again living up to their part of the bargain on nuclear weapons. I think with Iran, I would in fact investigate whether or not direct engagements, by which I mean direct talks with President Obama and Ahmadinejad or Khomeini to try to break loose the stalemate that we found ourselves in is a smart way to start, in part because he wins big in Iran domestically if he's willing to do that. He undermines the hardliners. The best policy advice I've ever heard on Iran is at every turn figure out what thing that you could do would most undermine the hardliners domestically, and then do that. This meets that criterion. It also, again, bolsters our position with respect to the rest of the world, because ultimately, assuming we're not going to use force, the only weapon we've got is sanctions that actually work because they're supported by other nations.
Yeah, I think I've never thought that we were going to get anywhere if we weren't willing to have discussions with the Iranians. I think you don't start at the top by trying to arrange a summit meeting between, whoever you decide at the top of the Iranian hierarchy and President Obama. You start a little bit further down the the chain of command and see how much progress you're making. I think the other ingredient that's more controversial there is the United States is going to have to take the threat of regime change off the table. And whether you do that up front or whether you do that relatively quickly in the discussions or maybe down the road, you have to make it clear that if the Iranians provide us with the kinds of arrangements we want, that we're prepared to then essentially give them the same deal we gave Libya, which is that we'll leave the regime in place. We're not going to try to destabilize it. We will overturn the congressional legislation that calls for regime change in various ways. That we're not in the business of trying to tell Iran how it's going to run its own country, or the Iranians how they're going to run their own country. And that would be controversial in the United States. The mantra for the last few years has been, all options have to remain on the table. The problem with essentially pointing a gun at Iran's head is it gives them every incentive to want to get a nuclear deterrent of their own.
Yeah.
If our goal ultimately is to persuade them not to have nuclear weapons, we're going to have to try and convince them that if they do that, if they refrain from getting them, their security isn't going to be imperiled. We're going to need some other things from them as well, and we're going to have to offer them some other carrots, I suspect, and along with possibly the economic sticks that you mentioned. But I think we're going to have to think of this as a more all-encompassing negotiation. It's not just talks. It also means altering the positioning that we've taken towards Iran over the last few years.
Well, I agree with a lot of that. There are two ways in which we can engage the Iranians and send that message while saving face a little bit. One is, as we've just discussed, launching a major non-proliferation initiative, and in that context, bringing Iran back to the table, letting it save face in the context of getting something from us if we're actually cutting our arsenals. And you're right, it's not going to be only us. The Russians would have to be in there as well, at least. But that's an opportunity to engage Iran in ways that allow it to back down a little bit, but also for us to effectively promise that we're not out to change the regime. But the other area, of course, is back to Iraq, back to the second item on the agenda. If no matter how we pull out, no matter what timetable, we are not going to just walk away from Iraq without a fairly robust understanding, if not actual formal agreement, among the key players in the region, and that has to include Iran. Indeed, as I see the region, it extends almost to India, with the EU on one side and India on the other. But at the very least, we have to be convening the EU, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, Israel, the countries that are critical to ensuring that Iraq remains as stable as it's going to be when we leave it. So there again, there's an opportunity to negotiate with Iraq and with Iran. And we have to. We can't walk out of Iraq and leave Iran there with no other understandings.
Right. And the key there is, again, recognizing what America's real interests are in that part of the world. I mean, we have really two major strategic interests there, possibly three. One is obviously oil, making sure that oil continues to be pumped out of the ground and shipped out to world markets. And the good news there is that doesn't mean the United States has to control the region. We don't have to occupy it and run it. We just want to make sure that the different countries there are still willing to sell oil. And the good news for us is all of those governments have an enormous economic interest in doing just that. The second concern we have is obviously terrorism that might originate from parts of that region. And there, the good news is that most of the governments in that region, not all, but most of the governments are worried about the same problem we are and are prepared to cooperate with us. In fact, more than they used to on that front. And again, a big American military presence there just makes that problem worse. The third one is of weapons of mass destruction, and most specifically Iran's ambitions. And as I was saying earlier, the problem is that pointing a gun at Tehran just gives them every reason to want to get them. I think we're going to have to put the gun away if we're going to persuade them to not actually proceed to weaponize. So all of this, by the way, pushes me to thinking that once we're out of Iraq, we don't leave the region strategically. We will still have allies in the region. We will still have a robust intervention capability but we should take American forces out of the area, keep them over the horizon the way we used to, and basically rely on a balance of power policy. And the good news there is that although Iran's strategic position has improved as a result of what we did in Iraq, they don't have an enormous amount of power projection capability. They're not going to be able to dominate the region, particularly if we're prepared to serve as a counterbalancer as needed. I agree with you that you want to have some understandings among all of the regional powers, but that's primarily a diplomatic effort. And fortunately, I think we'll actually find a receptive audience in a number of the other countries there.
Now, Steve, you gave 3 strategic interests: oil, weapons of mass destruction, and terrorism. I think most people would add, and I would, the security of Israel as an additional strategic interest. And that is the problem with pulling out and leaving Iran. Iran is still supporting terrorism, and if it's supporting terrorism and that terrorism, those groups are not only Hezbollah but also Hamas, then the argument about our pulling out looks different. And the great concern is we pull out in many ways and effectively create a situation either where Israel really feels threatened by Iran, or equally dangerously, in my view, Israel feels so threatened by Iran that Israel takes direct action against Iran, and then we're in trouble once again, even worse, with not only terrorism but the entire Muslim world.
Well, again, we want to do everything we can to discourage Israel from doing that. I'd say a couple points. First of all, I don't think Israel is a vital strategic asset. This may be a semantic issue. I think we have a moral commitment to the state of Israel that we ought to honor, and if Israel's security is directly threatened, then we ought to be prepared to come to its aid. I do not believe Iran, even an Iran down the road that might someday have a small nuclear capability, poses an existential threat to Israel, because Israel has a robust nuclear deterrent of its own, and the Iranians could not use their weapons against Israel without essentially committing national suicide, and I don't think they're suicidal. You're correct that Iran, for a variety of reasons, has been supporting groups like Islamic Jihad and Hamas and Hezbollah. But that's, again, a reason why the United States ought to be pushing very hard for a Middle East peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians, because that takes away that potential source of Iranian leverage. We also ought to be pushing hard for the Israelis and Syrians to finally sign the peace deal that's been kind of on the table for the last 15 years, precisely because that furthermore undercuts the Iranian position and their capacity to have influence in other parts of the Middle East. I mean, one of the reasons I put such a priority on pushing a two-state solution is not only is it good for all of our friends in the region, but the people who are going to be most bothered by it are precisely the ones we've had the most trouble with. And it's smart diplomacy to do things that are in your friends' interests and that make your enemy's position get weaker. So despite all of the obstacles to it, that to me is the one where you have the greatest potential benefits. Not in it solving every problem, it just makes all the other problems somewhat easier to deal with.
So I am being told that our time is up, so let me leave our audience with a summary of what we've advised the President. It is one full plate. After he's fixed the national and global economy, gotten us out of Iraq, gotten a strategy that works in Afghanistan, he then should turn to the Middle East and finally bring about an Israeli-Palestinian peace. Alternatively, he could restart the entire non-proliferation process. That's enough for any administration for 8 years, not just 4.
And on the 7th day, he will rest.
Indeed, indeed. It's been fun talking to you.
Nice talking to you, too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.